Well, good evening, friends and associates around town, across the globe, with us or deceased, actually friend or foe. I mean, hey, everybody's welcome to Public Affairs, Public Access this night of the 16th of February in 2012, the big year, according to some. And Colby is in the house. I'm Paul Colby. You who are tuning in tonight have probably seen me around these parts more than a few times already. And you know that I'm the wild man of politics and metaphysics and art and culture and culinary. Well, I don't want to reduce the list at all. I'm going to cover it all, but you know, most of the time here we get together to listen to me talk about public events, things going on out there in the consensus reality, and I cover them from an iconoclastic perspective. And when I go through events tonight, I'm going to be talking in political terms, not so much about Republican versus Democrat, but maybe enlightened versus hypnotized, or something like that. And when I talk about everything else that's going on, I'm just going to take you on some excursions, if that's appropriate, or not in agreement with some things that are being said by other voices out there. But most of the time what I say isn't what's being said by other voices out there. So welcome. Good to hear from you. And as I was saying, we do cover current events, but we also, on this show, we talk metaphysics and we talk a lot of other things. So before I get into talking about what's going on out there, I want to talk about what's going on in there, inside you, inside all of you, because you know you're all independent universes. And I'll try to keep this short. This is sort of your metaphysical lecture on a dime here, early part of the evening, so that you can, you know, use it as a seed, and maybe the thought will develop and maybe some perspectives will change. But you know, the vast majority of the population, to these eyes and to these ears, certainly seems to be in great measure hypnotized by what's going on in the consensus reality, as if they have no control over it, or as if they can't stand outside of it. And they also buy into a lot of systematic disinformation and sound bites substituting for real news that characterize most of the information flow in our modern age. And so I just want to say that in this age of enlightenment, even where many have become enlightened and are making progress in living their own life according to their own inner dynamic, regardless of what's going on out there, a lot of people still be trapped by the system. They still be trapped by the system. And I want to tell you something that I think is very wise, something that the eminent New Age biologist or New School biologist Bruce Lipton said in a book about 5 years ago, and in many lectures today. He says, the way to fight the system is not to be part of the system. And I think that is so important for all of you to know. You can buy into the parts of the system that work for you, but the parts that don't, you can just forget it. You all are part of the source that's within. You know, in this physical reality, nothing is good or bad until you put a label on it. When you're in alignment with who you really are, everything works. Well, I guess you're thinking, that's enough philosophy. Okay, that's enough philosophy for right now. Before I get into some specific presidential circus events, because we are in that big circus time of year, I want to talk about Whitney Houston passing on, and what you hear all the time on television, on news programs, and when people chat it up themselves. Because, you know, the context for these discussions almost always seems to be that a celebrity passes on and there's hints of drug abuse. Not in this case utterly confirmed yet by any official means, but there is plenty of talk about drug abuse by big celebrities. They are sort of our royalty. But what I think we seem to forget a lot of the time is that half of America is on prescription drugs. About half of the population uses them. About a third use 2 or more. Maybe 1 in 10 people even use 5 or more prescription drugs regularly. And what is so bad about that? Well, the fact is that about every 19 minutes, somebody dies in the United States from prescription drug abuse. Got that? Prescription drug abuse. The other night on CNN, we had Deepak Chopra and Dr. Drew Pinsky talking about this situation, and they covered some stuff that was better than superficial, but I want to go a little bit deeper than they did. It was pointed out by Deepak Chopra that 1 in 20 people using prescription drugs abuses them. Not news, is it? But it was also pointed out, think about this for perspective, as Dr. Pinsky pointed out, you remember all the rock stars of the 60s and up till about the middle 80s, these guys, and a few chicks too, took tons of illicit drugs, and with a few notable exceptions, those folks are all still with us, aren't they? Yeah, most of them are still with us. But long about 1985, you go into this new realm of prescription drugs and concierge doctors, and the problem is that all of these new pharmaceuticals don't work very well with alcohol. In fact, they can kill you. The real sources of addiction, though, aren't covered, except by people like Gabor Mate, who talks about addiction in a book I highly recommend, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Because, you know, we talk so much about addiction and we say, you know, drug abuse is bad, 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 and so forth. But what we really don't seem to get is that drugs themselves are surprisingly not that addictive. Most drugs are surprisingly not that addictive. What we have are personalities that have problems of addiction, and those personalities, they're not just adults, they're not just superstars, they're even kids these days. The fact is that the drugs themselves rarely get abused by other cultures. You can remember the real Native Americans, the Indians, had access to peyote, to mushrooms, to all sorts of things. They used them in concert with religious experiences or rites of passage, etc. It's only this society that's all messed up. And so I highly recommend you look into Gabor Mate's work. It's pretty easy to find on the web. Understand what he is basically saying. The conditions in which children develop in this country have been so corrupted and troubled over the last several decades that the templates for normal brain development are no longer present for many, many kids. And many of those kids are now adults, and addictive personalities are out there, not just in the world of popular music. They're out here everywhere. Having said that, I want to talk about something else that bugs a lot of people before I get to the presidential circus. And it bugs me because it's happening to me. I get calls all the time now on my cell phone. I get calls on my phone. And worse, I'm not saying I object to calls on the cell phone. Hey, I'm just like every other guy who's social. I like hearing from friends. What I don't like hearing from is people with a number that isn't even real, not saying who they really are, reaching not only my answering machine at home now, but my cell phone that I carry around with me as, you know, an assistant in life. I bet a bunch of you are irritated too. And robocalls, yeah, they're a big problem. You know, most of you are at least familiar with the Do Not Call registry, and even though it controls things, it leaves a few things wide open. And it's these holes that bug me because, you know, people conducting surveys are supposed to be able to, you know, slip it out of the web, which is the robocall province. You know, this is controlled, but charities, political organizations, people doing surveys can still make a call. Well, the people making surveys often are making surveys because they're trying to sell something. And in many cases, laws that exist right now say that somebody using robocall pre-recorded messages need to identify who is initiating the calls, and they have to initiate that along with providing a number or an address where they can be reached. do you get the feeling somebody is listening in on this show? That I'm not talking about any of you, but it just feels like we're being watched. Anyway, the problem is that some of the people who call you and identify who they are say they are account services, for example, whatever the hell account services is supposed to mean. And then if you respond to that call and you're irate that you got called from somebody who doesn't even administer your credit card, then they'll hang up on you if you complain, or occasionally you'll get into an argument with them and say, I'm going to report this number to the FTC, and they say, go ahead and report it, buddy. You try to call it back. Ha, 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 it's a rented number, not even our number. Ha, ha, ha. So a lot of people would like to see some reform of this kind of situation, in the sense that civil discourse requires that if you're a telemarketing scam artist, you should identify yourself as, hi, telemarketing scam artist trying to reach John Doe. And I think a lot of people would feel better about that. But you know what, so there's always an other side of these issues today, because in our modern culture, people may be irritated about that, but they may be just as guilty, because if they want to call somebody and not leave a trace of their number, or if they want to pretend like they're from Bolivia, say they have an area code for, well, you can go to the web, you can go to various services, and you can rent your own virtual number. And you can rent a virtual number that's just about anywhere on earth you want it, and you can make it untraceable. And you know, you can go to places like, well, today I was just looking them up, like Number without an E, N-U-M-B-R, or Vumber, or Jet Number, or Jangy, or Lord knows. There are any number of ways that the ordinary person can be just as evil and uncivil as the people that are bugging us in our homes. And so I say good riddance to all of them. I am disgusted about that. Well, and since we're talking about robocalls, I may as well get to one of the exceptions, political robocalls, because you know that campaigns will call you whenever they feel like it, and that's what they're doing. So here we are, ready to talk about the presidential circus, because it's getting to be more like a circus these days than it even normally is. And so I want to start by talking about what the Republicans are not saying in these debates and in their public presentations these days. And I'll go through everybody, and then I'll go through our current occupant of the White House, Obama. We'll say a little bit about everybody, because I think the only way to be fair, illustrative, democratic, civil, funny, and insightful is to just go down a list. And besides, my staff prepared this enormous briefing book, and I'm supposed to read it, and so I'm just getting to some of it now. But anyway, all right, so what the Republican candidates are saying this year. Well, you've heard what they're saying, and on top of it all, I think, is a consuming belief that the free market, and especially America's large corporations who have great tax arrangements with the federal government and most of the state governments, along with rich people who have very nice tax arrangements with the federal government and so forth. These people, these corporations, this system that we call free enterprise and a free market, that is the answer to everything that's wrong right now, and Obama's got it wrong. He's just failed miserably at doing what he's supposed to do. And even though people are a little distasteful these days about corporate behavior and the perks of the rich that they're paying for in a lot of cases, you can always carry this tune by invoking socialism as the big bad monster. And as a political scientist, I've always found that funny, because, you know, all right, we are in a democracy. In a democracy, that's a form of government in which everybody takes part, sure. But socialism is dragged out as a code word to strike down anything that somebody doesn't like who happens to be conservative on the right, or a Republican, or, you know, somebody who favors the way things are distributed in the current political economy. all right, as opposed to something that actually is focused on human need, and not just humans, but all sentient beings, and sentient beings including Gaia, Mother Earth, sweet lady she is. Anyway, and goddess she is. All right, so in socialism, though, if we just take it down to bare bones, and there are an infinite number of varieties of socialism, of course, that's a system where resources are put together and work is done, or programs are run for the benefit of all. And while people oppose socialism, some of them in their political discourse, they take certain things for granted. For example, like fire and police departments, a pretty good example of democratic socialism at work. I mean, we don't all have to go out and hire our own bodyguard or our own firefighter. In the ideal, public education would be another such example of something where a service is provided that benefits many, 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 many people, and in a cost-effective way that enables you to use, you know, books, technology, things like that would be pretty expensive if you did it all yourself. I'm not unaware of the homeschooling movement that's going on by people who awkwardly and strongly resist anything socialism, socialistic, et cetera, But what I'm trying to get at is, and oh, by the way, there is Social Security and Medicare, probably the most successful and most relied upon government programs out there, and those basically have their roots in the socialist movement that once flourished in America, as many of the ideas of which, of that party, of the socialists, have become mainstream ideas, and so we don't even see them as such. But lately, I'm telling you that you're basically talking about something that covers up for the fact that the public don't like Wall Street. And so I want to talk about private power, because you see, for all of these people, the Republicans especially, talking about big government as the problem, and let's give it back to the free market, the real problem in this day and age, I think, is big private power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said a long time ago that the first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. And anybody who can look at the modern environment where corporations have bought and sold all of the members of Congress and all of the political candidates for not only the presidency but for all sorts of offices, and who operate more or less with impunity because they write the laws more than we do, you would have to say, and once again, I think maybe I'm covering topics that bother people too much, but maybe I'm just being superstitious. In any case, public, John Q. and Jane Q. Public these days are not fond of corporate America. In fact, just a very recent survey, this is concerning Occupy Wall Street and Wall Street. And basically the number, even though a lot of people don't like Occupy Wall Street because they think it's a bunch of old hippies in new clothes and et cetera, even so, among mainstream Americans, there's a 2 times greater favorable impression of Occupy Wall Street than there is of Wall Street. And what we effectively are having, ladies and gentlemen, is socialism for the rich and hardworking, free individual efforts by all the rest of us. I think Gore Vidal talked about that a long time ago. I love the way he put it. And, you know, the Republicans will be arguing all the time. You hear them in some of the debates accusing Obama when we get these numbers like 99 and the 1, these percentages, the 99 and 1, they say, no class warfare, no class warfare. Because, obviously somebody needs to stand up for the 1%. But, a lot of us who are not Republicans watching these debates watch them, and we see that they're talking to a base that's not us, and we kind of see no class, just warfare. Enough said about that. Another thing that the Republicans tend to agree on, the candidates for this year, they want to talk about entitlements, and those have got to be cut. One thing about entitlements, you know, is that most of the people who get entitlements are legally entitled to them, and that's a good reason they're called entitlements. But to put the brunt of all of our economic problems and the presumed solution to all of our economic problems at the doorstep of entitlements and say that's where we got to swing the door big, well, whatever metaphor you want to use, swing the axe, swing the door, you know, swing the pendulum. I don't care which one it is, but they're just going in the wrong direction, because most of the people in the country actually, if you put them in the right frame of mind, would admit that they want something coming from elsewhere. For example, corporate welfare these days amounts to about $125 billion. That's a pretty conservative estimate. That's from the federal government alone. That's not counting state and local governments that bend over or trip over themselves trying to make things easy for businesses. And of course, the theory is that giveaways like this create jobs. But I want to read from a progress report from Norman Solomon, very, very recent thing, talking about that. He says, in practice, the theory is hogwash. The investigation by Time magazine recently established that almost without exception, local and state politicians have doled out tens of billions of taxpayer dollars to businesses that are in fact eliminating rather than creating jobs. Well, that's probably not news to you. So instead of dumping on entitlements, hey folks, if you're trying to tune into Middle America, you might want to consider chopping a little dead weight there. And that's not the only place. Oh, no, no, no. We have what I frequently call on my appearances here a war machine. And the war machine kind of takes in a lot of your tax money. In fact, currently, those conservative official numbers say about $800 billion. And you know very well, if you've watched some of my past shows, that is a novelty number, far from the truth. It should be 2 or 3 times that when you count all the real things like the supplemental war budgets, the black ops, the covert operations, and the surveillance on ordinary Americans, which passes for surveillance against terror. Ha, 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 ha. Ooh. And I don't want to trip on any toes there, but in any case, you know, we spend more than the next 10 largest militaries combined years, decades after the Cold War is over. And think about this, ladies and gentlemen. We spent, well, we went to Iraq when we didn't have any justification for doing that. We destroyed their infrastructure. We let Halliburton and others rebuild it. We left and accomplished next to nothing, because there was nothing threatening to us in the first place. If Afghanistan, been there about 10 years, been there about 80,000 troops, and this year we send in a special ops team and take out Osama bin Laden. Special ops team, not 80,000 people, 10 years. Something doesn't look right here. Several recent articles, and I could dig into more, but you know, several recent articles, one by Kevin Kyle in the North Wind, pointed out that the enormous amount of money spent on the military is completely unnecessary, makes us appear as a country set on imperial domination in the eyes of other countries. And in fact, by decreasing the amount we spend on the military, we may be in fact making ourselves safer in the long run. The Department of Defense Buzz, DOD Buzz that is, had an article on the populist headwinds recently, and it said, the majority of the public wants military spending reduced. A coalition of community, labor, faith, and peace organizations believes that much larger cuts would make us safer, create jobs, protect the natural environment, expand civil liberties, and save lives. So, what am I saying here? We don't need to put the whole burden on entitlements. We need to reorient our entire spending priorities. A third thing you hear a lot of the Republicans say, well, universally, I guess, Obamacare has got to go. And you know, here we are. I'm always telling you that I'm iconoclastic. I don't look at things black and white, you know, good guy, bad guy. I also don't like Obamacare. But for different reasons than most of the Republicans don't like it. Like most of the country, I favor a single-payer system, and the number favoring that continues to grow. Let's go back here just for a minute to our discussion about socialism, because, you know, whenever somebody suggests something like a single-payer health care system, people say, oh, free health care, you can't do that. Well, hey, it's not free. You know, we all pay our taxes. The problem is right now, our taxes are going to finance things that a whole bunch of us don't want them financing. So if we made a decision like Britain did after World War II that we have this money and we've decided we're going to use it for a system for us, for health care, which we paid for, then we can do that. It's us that says we change the priorities. But what have we got right now under Obamacare? Yeah, we had some improvements. Some people can't be denied coverage by insurance companies because of a pre-existing condition. That's noble, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want any system where I have to buy insurance from an insurance company. They're not interested in health. I don't want to be part of any system where the emphasis is on big pharma, as I call them, pharmaceutical industries, the giant lobby that basically runs healthcare right now. You know, you could look at, I suggest you look at, for example, I'm sure you can find this if you Google it, Gary Null's study on the myth of AIDS, not only talking about how much of conventional wisdom is simply right off the map, but talking about the fact that $60 to $80 billion has gone down that rat hole basically for people buying drugs. Makes a lot of money for the pharmaceutical companies. How many of those people get cured? Well, different subject. You know, if you wanted to cure people instead of setting them up so that they could take drugs for a long time, just ameliorating conditions, then you might have a whole different system, and it might be called health care, health, rather than, you know, dealing with medical trauma. Because that's what we do, a lot of us, until this enlightened age when people are behaving differently, is that we just go on with our bad habits thinking it won't catch up with us, and when it does catch up with us, then we go to that system and we think the doctor will have a magic bullet for everything. But if I were running a healthcare system that was about health, then our free system, I'm going to bow to those who call it free, but our single-payer system would include things like yoga classes, meditation, teaching people how to breathe, neuro-linguistic programming, color therapy, sound therapy, all of the stuff that is out there on the cutting edge of health, not necessarily medicine, or unless you want to call it energy medicine, which it is. All of the stuff that keeps you from developing the horrific condition at the end that leaves you practically strangled, helpless, deflated, demoralized, in need of drugs just to keep yourself going. You got me? How many of your healthcare systems pay for yoga and meditation? And that's a short list. Anyway. Okay, another thing, before I leave this topic, another thing you'll hear Republicans talk about a lot, and this was brought up to me recently by some of my staffers, Keystone Pipeline, environmental, you know, all of this talk, you know, that you see on TV these days about Keystone makes it look like a deliverance from what we've been having to go through in the past, you know, relying on a source of energy that we got right here. But, you know, here's the context I would like to put around this little baby here, and that is that just think about last year. It was a pretty big year for oil and gas disasters. In addition to the, well, you got the BP blowout. How about that? But you also had a leak on the BP's Trans-Alaska pipeline. You also had a 1 million-gallon oil spill in Michigan. You also had a gas explosion that killed 37 in California. So a lot of people, other than those making commercials and talking up, you know, our sources of energy that we have right here, a lot of people are weary of doing it the same old way, especially when for the last 50 years we could have been converting the economy and giving what government grants there are and what tax breaks there are exclusively to new forms of energy, not the old ones that we're dragging out of the ground. But and so you have the Republicans like Santorum as an example talking about the facade, the man-made facade of global warming. Well, I'll tell you something, folks. Only Americans, only in America can people believe that. In the rest of the world, you're not going to find that sort of stuff. And let's just be more specific. There's a near total consensus about that, except for the people who work for or do studies for example, Exxon or the Koch brothers. Those are the two largest financiers of global warming denial. And in fact, you have sort of like the entire scientific community on one side and then those who are producing studies for Exxon and the Kochs. That's on the others. And Exxon even said, you know, back in 2006, they said they were going to stop doing it because people complained about that fact. And so in traditional devious American political fashion, they started just channeling their money for global warming denial studies into other areas like the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, the International Policy Network in the UK, the Cato and Heritage Foundations, but they keep it going. So there is continuing to be this discussion that says there is no global warming, and no problem with these global with emissions from like these nice sources. Let's go to Keystone again. Let me tell you exactly what I'm talking about here. And I know that a bunch of unions support Keystone. So see, even though I usually vote Democratic for the lesser of two evils, I disagree with the unions there. Why is that? This Keystone project here, talking about these tar sands that are going to come from up in Canada all the way down here to Nederland, Texas, hot diggity dog, they're going to increase the dangers of global warming. In fact, the government's own estimates say 80% greater emissions than currently used, and some independent estimates put that at 3 times the current level, 3 times the current level. Another thing that's being talked up a lot is fracking. Fracking, you know, when we're talking about the great future from natural gas. And you see all of these commercials on TV, you know, I vote and I'm in favor of domestic energy. And this commercial was paid for by the petroleum industry. And so you talk about hydraulic fracturing of gas wells. Yeah, you have 2.5 million gallons for the average well that stays in the ground after you frack a well. Some of you may be familiar with a documentary film that is really taking off that talks about the dangers of hydraulic fracking. It's called Gasland by Josh Fox, and it's very important. Josh Fox recently showed up at a congressional hearing on minerals, and he wanted to videotape it, and you know, he was escorted by police out of the chambers where Congress was discussing fracking and the dangers of fracking. Isn't that amazing? In a country like ours, you can get moved out of the room for filming or videotaping the deliberations of Congress. Does this seem a little bit odd? Well, if that isn't odd enough, in the current political climate, you know what? There's an actor, I don't watch The Kids Are All Right very much, but actor Mark Ruffalo was a big proponent of this film, Gasland. He helped to promote the documentary, and after he spoke out about it, he got himself put on a government terrorist watch list. So, if you think we have other sources of energy beyond the ones we have to endure right now, you could very well be a terrorist. And thank God, I know I'm one if that's true. And it's kind of like we have a criminal justice system. It's really weird, you know? It's really weird, folks. I want to tell you that despite the fact that all of the Republican candidates are saying things like that, we really need to look at what they're each individually saying. Okay, so that's what I'd like to do now. I'd like to talk about them all, and then I'd like to talk also about President Obama, the sitting president. But first, we've got Romney, and the Republican Party can't seem to entirely warm to him. Now, he's got business credentials. You know, he does have business credentials, but he makes those the showpiece of his campaign. And the main problem with that is the government is not a business, and that's going to recycle back. You see how I always tie these things together. Government's not a business because not all of the things that need to be done for all of America need to make a profit. Take a political science course, take an economics course. Yes, we are free to make a profit here, but not everything that goes on in this country, and let's put healthcare in here too, needs to be a profit-making machine. And we have talked before about how people these days feel about corporations and feel about the very rich and feel about politicians. And that's why this may seem to sell, in some places, it's just not universally selling. But one thing I would say, you know, about Governor Romney is that most of his money comes from 41 people. A quarter of the campaign comes from 41 people. And Romney is the kind of guy who has made quite a few statements over the years, quite a few flip-flops. And my point is going to be that if I were advising him, I would say your slogan should be that whatever your position is on an issue, I have probably been right there with you at some point in my career. I just happened to pick up something from Red State the other day, or from Northwestern University's William Meyer, and this is just talking about the flip-flops that Romney has made on issues, pro-choice and then not pro-choice, backing a path to citizenship and changing his mind on that, endorsing the Bush tax cuts and refusing to endorse them and then later making them part of his campaign, refusing to sign the ATR pledge against raising taxes in 2002 and then signing it in 2007 and on and on and on and on. So the problem with Romney right now, I think, is that his biggest opponent, in addition to the part of his biography that he wants to sell that is not impressive to a whole lot of other people, and at this point not that impressive even to the Republican base that he's trying to reach. His biggest problem seems to be that he's at war with the English language and putting his foot in his mouth quite a lot. But we know that among all of those Republican candidates, Romney has the big treasure chest. Everybody else is they're straining to catch up. Even if they have momentum, they can't get the financing that he has because, I mean, it's just not there, okay? And it occurred to me the other day that the best thing that Romney could do would be to use some of that money to secretly finance Rick Perry getting back in the race, because it seemed like he was doing a whole lot better when he had Rick Perry to push around, don't you think? I mean, it looked a whole lot better back then. So that's our main man. Let's move on to Newt Gingrich, because Newt is, well, there's a whole lot of things that you could say about Newt because he's got such a long history, but and he was riding the wave there for a while. He seems to have fallen off the wave now. But I want to tell you something here. In talking about the moon colony, I personally agree with what Newt's vision is, that we really should have a colony on the moon. But I've been disturbed, even though I support that, I've been disturbed by things I see out there on the internet lately that may explain his motivations for a moon colony differently. Fried chicken reserves on the moon, or this really disturbed me the other day. I noticed that Fannie Mae wants to set up a headquarters on the moon. Now, you know, it's a little bit confusing to me. It's kind of confusing to me, and I think if his motives for going to the moon are, you know, pure vision, like I think they are, you know, that would be very high octane. Maybe it's just not playing that well in this campaign because he is not tying it to something else. Like we have the illegal immigration issue going on, real big for all of the Republican candidates, and maybe he could have tied them together. You know, we're going to send all of the illegal immigrants to a moon colony, or, you know, he will lash out at President Obama and that school of radicals, Saul Alinsky school of. And by the way, let me just stop for a minute. Saul Alinsky, you know, I bet even most of Newt Gingrich's supporters, even if they understand that Newt Gingrich says Saul Alinsky must be a bad guy, then they have to go ahead and believe Saul Alinsky is a bad guy, but they probably don't know who he is, and they just accept at face value that he's some dangerous radical. But I would recommend looking up somewhere on the web Bill Moyer's defense of Saul Alinsky. I found it quite interesting because he was just an ordinary activist, not exactly a wild man, you know, left radical. And if he was the model for Barack Obama, then so much the better. But anyway, I want to get back on point. Newt is not winning his issues like the moon colony. And the other big issue that Newt has is that he was very close to Ronald Reagan. And that might be an important issue, but I think he's selling it the wrong way. So if I were going to give advice to Ronald Reagan protege, Mr. Newt Gingrich, I'd say it like this. You have to put a chart out there and explain to people how close you really were, like, and spell it out. Back in 1982, I was within 2 miles. So, for example, he was in a cab and he was, you know, near the White House. And then there was this time in 83, 820 feet. I mean, he was heading for lunch at, you know, you get my drift. And then the time when they were just and just kind of build up to it, but put it in a chart and show how close. I think, you know, maybe Newt just needs to rethink how he sells his various points. And then we have, of course, the man who's making strides of late. That would be Rick Santorum, and the biggest strides he seems to be making of late come from the assertion that the Obama administration is attacking the Catholic Church. And you all know the particulars. It deals with the fact that when a church-related organization, hold this now. When a church-related organization makes available health care plans to employees, some of whom may not be churchgoers, they shouldn't be forced to provide, for example, contraceptives. And that's the case that applies here to Catholics. So the oddity about all of this is that in actual fact, Mr. Santorum is not even lining up with what most Catholics want, because most Catholics, when asked to provide, and I even looked up a chart here the other day showing it, 58% of Catholics, they favor providing employees health care plans that cover contraception or birth control. And that's just Catholics generally. I'm not even talking about women per se, but if you go to the larger population, especially if you go to women, you will find more like a 61% margin of those recently surveyed approve of the Obama administration requiring health plans to provide birth control coverage as part of health care for women. But think about this for a minute now. Think about the implications of this if you, and you've already seen this happening. It's the Blunt Amendment, okay? Just as soon as this cat is out of the bag, look what happens in Congress. The Republicans want to stampede and take it even further, even further. They want to deny coverage for any number of things that, well, maternity care, testing for HIV, mental health services, screening for cervical cancer, any number of things might be included if you let employers decide what they are morally opposed to providing. But you know, so this debate got framed in terms of, well, Gingrich said as well as Santorum, you know, Obama's going to come out in a second term viciously attacking the Catholic Church. Oh my goodness, what kind of comic books do these guys read? In essence, if a Christian, for example, a Catholic, let's say, worked at the offices of the Christian Science Monitor newspaper, then he should be entitled to have surgery even if his employer doesn't believe it. That should be covered in his health care plan. That's really what it comes down to. And I got to say, this is what it really means is that folks like Santorum are quite ready to defend your religious freedom so long as that lines up with their version of religious freedom. And so let me just put this in the context of the contradictions even in Santorum's position, because he's talking as a Catholic. Now, me, I'm a lapsed Catholic. Lapsed Catholics like myself who are intelligent and curious often become Gnostics. You know, we find out that Jesus, for example, was a Gnostic teacher, and then we look up the Gnostic opposites. But even if you're talking in terms of conventional Catholic beliefs, okay, you want to put it like that. Think about this: Pope John Paul II was against anyone going to a war against Iraq. See, so that's a Catholic position, but that's not the position that Rick Santorum had. The Conference on Catholic Bishops, before all of this got started, required in one of their statements that health care be provided to all Americans, not the position of mainstream Republicans. The Catholic Church still to this day opposes the death penalty for criminals in nearly all cases, not the position of the religious defenders. The Conference of Bishops has urged, for example, that the federal minimum wage be increased for the working poor, not exactly Santorum's position. So you see, that's what it comes to. But let me just, before we close out this religious issue and move on to somewhere else, I'm reminded of a time there was another president who put this in correct perspective, because you see, the president is not supposed to be a spokesman for his religion. He's supposed to be the protector of everyone's religious freedom to believe what they want. In this case, we see a Republican party that is bent on giving employers more rights, and in fact, then that comes out essentially being an opposition to religious freedom, where Obama's original plan is, and especially his revision to accommodate the people, was essentially a defense of religious freedom. But who said it best of all? You can guess. While you're guessing, I'll give it to you in some of the flavor, because it was early on that John Kennedy ran for president, and he was a Catholic, but he approached this all very differently. And he said it sort of like this. I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. And folks, that's really what we need at this time in our collective movement towards a better civilization, a better consensus reality, and a better planetary functional system. One more thing I'm going to say about Santorum before I leave this and move on to the last candidate, Ron Paul, and then Obama. Santorum has a problem, which is probably expressed as part of these deeply held religious beliefs. He has a problem with women serving in combat. And you think about what he said recently. This is interesting. I do have concerns about women in frontline combat. I think there can be a very compromising situation where people naturally may do things that may not be in the interest of the mission because of other types of emotions that are involved. And so if that means that they see that civilians are being slaughtered, they should probably speak up, like, say, Bradley Manning did. And probably some women would be more likely to do that. And gosh, that worries him. Let me talk about Ron Paul a minute, because here's somebody, the only one in the field that's actually getting support from other places. He stands against the Patriot Act and for civil liberties. Hardly anybody else on the stage these days, the national stage, will point out how atrocious was and is the Patriot Act. And it's about time to get rid of that sorry spectacle, that terrible chapter of our history, by wiping the whole thing out and getting it out. To that extent, he gets a lot of support. And you know, everybody is bothered by airport searches these days and the other stuff that is done in the name of liberty. It's getting ridiculous when you have cavity searches. I was just looking at a decision by the Fifth Circuit where they saw a cavity search of a person for drugs, which they called unreasonable, jarring, and demeaning, but they said, well, it's okay anyway because there's a warrant. Horrible stuff. Now, Paul also talks about, and by the way, instead of using all of this surveillance on the American people, how about using all of these resources of our intelligence agencies and these war on terror things directed against American citizens, against phone scammers and people like that? If we're going to have technology that snoops, why don't we go snooping after the right people? Okay, Ron Paul also talks about not being the world's policeman. Hooray to that. He doesn't like perpetual war. As I have pointed out on many programs before this, you know, having 1,000 bases in 130 countries doesn't help our image at all. He, for example, would be the only one who doesn't buy into the whole thing about the Iranian nuclear problem. You know, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta let slip the fact just last Sunday that as far as the intelligence community knows, Iran is not pursuing the ability to split the atoms with weapons. And we are living in a perpetual propaganda state. You may recognize it. It's similar to when we were having the run-up to the war with Iraq. And so if you believe everything that's being said about that, well, good for you, but maybe you want to read some things other than what's in the mainstream alert. And I know we're offending some people now. But another thing Ron Paul talks about, indefinite detention. Yeah, not of Gitmo prisoners, but of citizens of the United States by the military without very much other authority. He talks about the Federal Reserve and the money supply, and, you know, a lot of people would like to poo-poo that, but the only really decent audit we have of it that came up recently talked about $16 trillion in loans, $16 trillion that the Fed made to some of the largest institutions and corporations in the U.S. and throughout the world, and we just can't seem to find any money for the needs of common American citizens, so we got to cut their entitlements. Yeah, Ron Paul is about the only one in the current Republican debate, who is drawing support from people who are not part of that Republican base. I think you can understand that's why. Let me just say a few things about President Obama in closing, and you'll see that I'm not holding him up. I'm going to hold his feet to the fire too. First of all, I think one reason that he's in trouble is he has ceded the whole youth vote, much of it, and certainly some of the progressive vote to Ron Paul, because he won't stand up for anything that the people who actually elected him wanted him to do. And one of the things that's sticking out like a sore thumb these days is his appointment Monsanto lobbyist, Michael Taylor, to a position in the FDA that it's just disgusting to me. You know, most of you know that Monsanto is responsible for most of the genetically modified stuff on the planet, and that includes much that's in your grocery store. And in an alternate reality dream that I had the other day, I walked into a food store and I saw a sign saying that the foods on this aisle contain GMOs and the effect on humans isn't tested. Wouldn't that be wonderful to wake up to? However, the reality is different. Now, even though India has been brave enough to file a suit against Monsanto, we haven't. And in fact, you can expect, in just the instant future to see a new version of corn coming to your Walmart. It won't be labeled. You won't necessarily know that it's genetically modified, but it is. So maybe go to the internet and look up that biologically different corn that's coming to your Walmart, because you probably won't see a sign like the one I just showed you in any store where you buy food. And so here's something I'd say. We have Americans on food stamps these days in record numbers, about 46 million of them. What I would recommend is that they take all of their food stamps and they at least go to some kind of health food store. I won't name a specific one, but some sort of health food grocery store, and buy real food instead of genetically modified food, because at least in a health food store you can see it labeled as organic or words to that effect. And Obama, well, he hasn't done that much to excite me, but at least he's not doing some of the god-awful things that are being proposed by people who would take over from him. And gee whiz, it's hard to be excited by that. I mean, it would be nice if instead of the ghost issues that we see being discussed in this current campaign, and in spite of the superficial, aimless discussions we see these days about drug addiction when somebody like Whitney Houston passes, and in spite of the inane things that come across the phone lines because we can't stop them from coming across the phone lines, we could all just decide to check out of the stuff that's bogus, and we could check out of the parts of the system that we think are disgusting and say, there's got to be a better way, and it's us. It's us. We're going to behave and live the way we think it's possible to behave and live, because we don't have to be bound by this, and we don't be putting up with it anymore. Hey, as usual, it's been really exciting talking to you and knowing some of you are so far away. And if we stepped on any feet tonight, I certainly hope they were the ones that I meant to step on and not somebody I was trying to dance with. And that being true, I'm going to leave you. Well, you know, I'll always be here, but you can't necessarily come here. So I am, in effect, going to leave you until next time. And I hope you have the most exciting spring you've had in a hell of a long time. Bye.